Welcome to Emmo Forum 2014. I'm joined by Geoff Kitney, who is a senior writer, journalist and columnist at the National Press Gallery. Thanks for joining us, Geoff. The idea of the discussion today is to go back to your experience when you first started working as a journalist in Canberra. And the question really that I'm seeking to address is, how has the political discourse changed over that period, and in association with it, how have the methods and approach to media reporting changed, and really what are the implications for the future of those changes? Are they good? Are they bad? What does it all mean for political debate in this country?
Mm-hmm.
So welcome.
Thanks, Greg.
I wonder if you could start by just giving us the origins of your move to Canberra. I think you were telling me off air it was a very long time ago.
Yeah, too long to remember, really. Well, I started in journalism in country newspapers in Western Australia. My father was a farmer and for a very brief period, a country party politician.
Did he know Peter Walsh?
No, he was sort of pre-Peter Walsh, which is going back a long way. I got, because my father was a politician, the editor of the paper said, you can report politics. So that's where it all started, entirely accidentally. I then got posted to Canberra as the Canberra correspondent for the Perth Daily News, as it was called, now defunct, like all afternoon newspapers all over the world, all gone.
And was that a Fairfax?
No, that was it was owned by WA Newspapers, which subsequently became owned by the Herald and Weekly Times.
Okay.
And is now owned by the West Australian entrepreneur.
Stokes.
Yeah, Kerry Stokes. I arrived in Canberra on the weekend of the Bass by-election, which was the by-election
1974?
1975, June 75. It was the by-election to find a successor to Lance Barnard, who had left the Whitlam government to take up a diplomatic posting, and it was the beginning of the last 6 months, or the last 5 months of the Whitlam government.
Wow.
And it was just crisis after
turbulent
crisis.
Times.
Absolutely turbulent.
And Lance Barnard was the occupant of one of two cabinet positions.
That's right.
When the Whitlam government was
probably
formed.
the period of the greatest flurry of reform ever in Australia.
So we had
a two-man government.
They set up a two-man cabinet.
Right. Yes.
Gough Whitlam and Lance Barnard, and then so he went off for a diplomatic posting. And I have memories of this too. This was a period when this Bass by-election was seen to be a test of the standing of the Whitlam government.
And Labor got thumped, absolutely thumped. And that was when the coalition began to think about the possibility of blocking supply, that this government was a disastrous government that had to be removed. And then we had, 6 months or 5 months of turmoil between the House and the Senate.
Yes.
And
was the Khemlani affair running at that time?
It started to run very soon after that. The Loans affair occurred, I think, in July, the beginning. Whitlam actually recalled Parliament for a one-day sitting in, I think it was July the 9th, something like that, he said, table all the documents, give the opposition the chance to ask all the questions, bring the whole thing to a head and bring it to an end. After that, I think, and this is testing my memory, but I think it was after that it was revealed that Rex Connor had been secretly negotiating with Middle Eastern interests for funds to develop resource projects in Australia.
And that included a gas pipeline from the west.
Yeah, also, there was a whole agenda of things that he wanted to do. And Whitlam sacked him because he hadn't told Whitlam. And then the whole Khemlani thing emerged, and it was just extraordinary. I think somebody told me that I had the longest run of page one lead stories ever by one reporter on the newspaper, going back throughout
so
history.
So who was your source, Geoff?
Didn't need sources then. Everybody was falling over themselves to
have a chat.
Yeah, exactly.
So you were with the Perth Daily News for some time and then joined another outfit called the National Times.
That's right. Yeah, I was hired to become the political correspondent in Canberra for the National Times, which was a Fairfax publication.
Yeah.
Famous for its investigative reporting.
Yes.
Seen as liberal left, I suppose you would say.
So that progressive left, not Liberal Party left.
No,
Yeah.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
It was, I think, it was essentially it was a newspaper that had the best ideals of journalism, which was sceptical journalism.
Mm-hmm.
Not taking on face value anything that was put to it, willing to take risks to investigate, what was going on behind the seats of power and so on. It was a very interesting newspaper to work on.
Well, I didn't know you in those days, but I too was a contributor to the National Times.
Indeed, I remember.
And for our Emmo forum, being a pretty good collector of bowerbird of documents, I kept this. And that's a story of mine about tax avoidance. The more things change, the more they seem to stay the same. And you're on pages.
You relegated me to page 3.
It was a great story. I was at the ANU at that time, so that's you, fracture show in cabinet over Fraser's dead-end course. And there you are again on page 5, quick decision likely on Granny Bond plan. Don't know what happened to the the quick decision must have been to dump it.
Yeah, I presume so.
But anyway, the point of that is this is a major document that involves the results of a fair bit of investigative reporting, and the chances of seeing something like that these days would be negligible to zero.
Yeah. It doesn't exist really anymore.
Yeah. So this is what I really wanted to talk about. You've come in at the latter stages of the Whitlam government. You've reported through the period of the Fraser government, Hawke government, Keating government, Howard government, Rudd government and Gillard government, and now Abbott government. That's a lot of experience, and you would have noticed a lot of changes. So I wanted to go on to ask you, what has been if you could summarise the change that has occurred in the nature of the political debate. I'm not seeking to be party political here, the nature and content of the debate, and the role of the media, if there is one, in those changes.
Well, it's ebbed and flowed, of course, through all that period, and there have been different ideas of what constituted reform. Obviously, the Whitlam government had a very dramatic social agenda and introduced reforms that have stood the test of time, that are still, which changed the nature of Australia.
Like Medicare, Medibank, which became Medicare.
And free university which is probably in many ways the most significant reform. The family law issues a whole lot of things. In those days, nobody really talked about economic reform.
No, that's right.
Until
I think Gough was a bit bored by it.
Well, Gough wasn't really interested in economics, and made some bad appointments to be treasurer. And it was only really the last 6 months. I can't remember when Bill Hayden was appointed.
Bill Hayden became treasurer. Was he treasurer? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And actually, Bill Hayden was probably the first significant Australian politician to talk about the need for Australia an economic reform agenda. His task, though, was basically to rescue the budget.
Yes.
And he did a pretty good job of that. In fact, the last Whitlam budget really did start to, he did make some significant progress in winding back spending and so on. But of course, that budget was the one that got blocked by the Senate, and which brought down the Whitlam government ultimately. I think through the Fraser years, there was growing impatience amongst economists and probably in some section of the business community about the fact that Australia needed to start doing some really bold economic things. The Fraser cabinet was dominated by the Country Party. Fraser himself was instinctively a farmer and instinctively protectionist. So it was only really when Hawke came into office when economic reform really became the central issue in Australian politics.
Now, I think Treasurer Howard, he replaced Phil Lynch. He was into the reform stuff.
Absolutely. And he was, I don't know, the story that you referred to in that may well have been related to the fact that Howard and the people around him were the ones who were very impatient about the fact
Right.
that Fraser just wasn't interested in
Yeah.
the reforms.
Yeah.
I think in that context, the drives in the Liberal Party, so-called economic drives.
Yes, John Hyde.
Yes,
was
John
the leader
Hyde.
of them.
Bert Kelly actually going back,
Right.
and from the Financial Review point of view, Bert Kelly started writing a column called The Modest Farmer in the Financial Review in the 70s, I think, where he advocated reductions in tariff protection and broad economic reform. And the drives picked up that agenda, and Howard became their leader in politics,
Yes,
in federal parliament. But he was outnumbered in the Fraser government, and really wasn't able to do much.
Yeah.
But the significant thing about that was when Hawke and Keating began to embrace
the
reform,
program.
Howard was basically in support of that agenda. So you, for the first time, had a focus on economic reform and
A level
a general
of
bipartisanship. Yeah, that's right. It wasn't pure bipartisanship, but Howard was very strongly criticised in the Liberal Party in those days for not being critical enough, not being oppositionist enough to Fraser.
Well, it could be argued it helped him become Prime Minister.
Ultimately.
Because by 1996, he'd been around for a fair while.
Yeah.
He had a
That's exactly
consistency
right.
of approach. And
But-
I said, well, we know this guy. We'll give
But
him a go.
in 1985, 86, 87, that criticism of Howard became the Joe for Canberra movement.
Yes.
When
remember it
those
well.
exactly, the hardline conservatives on the conservative side of politics decided that Howard was a disaster,
Yeah.
and they had to go into Canberra to to take on the Labor Party. So the fact that there were two things about that reform period. One was a degree of bipartisanship, which helped get some big things done, and the fact that after the Joe for Canberra forces started, there was effectively no opposition. The opposition just fell away. It became completely obsessed with itself.
Yes.
And Howard and Keating and Hawke were able to dominate the debate in Australia.
That's true. And I started working for Hawke at that time.
Yes.
And, within days of Paul Keating warning of us becoming a banana republic, I was asked to help draft a speech about all of that. But events.
The other thing
all that.
about that, I think, looking at it now in the historical context, was that was an unusual period in Australia. It was a period when reform was possible because of those factors and because of the unique relationship between the Labor leadership then and the trade union movement.
Yeah.
And the
Which
harnessing
was pretty powerful.
Absolutely,
About 60% of all working Australians were members of unions.
Right, yeah.
And now it's less than 20%.
Yes, well, that's another one of the big changes. But the Keating-Kelty relationship was extremely important in identifying the need for reform and getting a consensus for reform. And Hawke brought his great public credibility.
The conciliation.
Yes, exactly. And also what was interesting about that was the willingness of business to cooperate with a Labor government.
In fact, that's when the Business Council of Australia was formed.
That's right, yes, the economic
the
summit.
larger companies wanted to have a place at the table and not just be in an adversarial situation.
That's right. So there was a coincidence of factors there that meant that change was possible in a way that normally in Australia is not. And one of the problems I think now is that you don't have that consensus or that sort of coincidence of personalities, of circumstances in the economy, and of the organisations that all the people with an interest in are all coming together at the one time.
Yeah.
So,
well, I think in the interest of time, we could go then through the Howard government, the Rudd government, the Gillard government, but you really touched on where this conversation needs to go, and that is what is different now compared with that period of reform. Why is there no consensus, and how is political debate or discussion, debate might be making it a bit lofty, how is this political discussion conducted these days compared with an important period which was a reform era?
Well, I think just going back to the very basic level, the reform agenda then was big things. It was things that were in the power of the federal government, essentially, to change. I think the reform agenda now is much more dispersed and involves a lot more people who have to make decisions to allow things to change. For example, state governments. You know, a lot of the seamless economy reforms require the states to make decisions. So the whole thing has become more dispersed and more difficult from that point of view. There are other things that happened, I think, that have made it harder now and may mean that we'll never get back to that period of when the whole political, you know, the whole conversation was united about what needed to be done. One was, I think, the fight back changes that John Hewson proposed, the fight back agenda.
The early 1990s.
Yes, that was before the 1993 election. When, I mean, I think you can argue that what the Hewson agenda was actually where we needed to go next, but it became, you know, the issue. It gave Paul Keating, you know, the huge stick to beat Hewson to death, basically.
And it was about the GST.
Well, the GST was a key part of it, but that agenda was. But that was the key thing.
That's right.
That's right. It was very broad, but the GST was the total.
And I know I've debated John Hewson with him on television, and he kind of both yearns for that period and laments what he did, because people who are watching Emmo Forum understand what the small target strategy means. Well, John Hewson was the architect of the big target strategy.
And that is the point at which everybody, you know, who's involved in, you know, taking political risks looks back and says, we won't do that again. Don't do that.
Well, Andrew Robb was, I think, in the Liberal Party Secretary at the time. Linton Crosby. Some of these people then say, we'll never forget.
Yeah, that's right. And so that sort of took away from the political agenda, the political debate. You know, the willingness, the people who were prepared to be brave and.
But at the same time, Keating himself was implementing some important reforms.
Yes, he did.
National competition policy, not popular.
No.
At all. He did make some fundamental changes.
And he began the process of industrialisation reform, that's right.
Yeah, because he moved from still a reasonably centralised wage fixing system to enterprise bargaining. Very unpopular with the trade union movement at that time. So it's kind of not as if they abandoned reform, but you're sort of saying they abandoned.
But the Labor Party did abandon Keating after the 1996 election.
Yes, that's right.
Basically, they decided repudiated all
the whole agenda.
Exactly, and that's a big problem, I think, for the reform agenda and reform process. And I don't think the Labor Party's ever really recovered from that. I think terrible
error.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's right. Then Howard, of course, came in. Howard and the GST. He introduced the GST. That was an unpopular change, but people ultimately accepted it.
I remember polling on that was published, which said, "Do you think the GST is in your interests?" Answer: no. Do you think it's in the national interest? Answer: yes. Do you support the GST? Yes. Well, so the instincts of the Australian people have been pretty good.
Yes, they have, and I think they're still there. I think if the case is made, and I mean, I suppose if you look at the carbon tax, you'd have to argue that if there is a united force against such a reform, a really powerful oppositionist force, then you can't do it. It's really
and I better put my hand up here. I was an opponent of the GST and still think that it wasn't the right policy. Right. Nevertheless, you can't fault the reform motivation behind it. John Howard didn't think that doing this would harvest a whole lot of votes for him, and it was politically popular. It was quite the opposite.
Yeah, no, that's right. But he saw it as an essential reform. Yeah. He then moved on to workplace reform, industrial relations reform, And I think work choices. You can argue the merits of whether or not that was justified, or whether that was we needed to go that far with workplace reform, but it certainly damaged the case for economic reform. That it was so to the unions and to working people. The fact that people were disadvantaged under that system really gave reform a bad name, if you like.
And I remember John Howard expressing shock that some businesses took full advantage of work choices. That is, they could cut people's pay and conditions, and did.
Yes.
And he thought that the flexibility would be well worth having, but he just didn't think that they'd behave that way.
Well,
I'm not talking about all businesses.
No.
But some of those really outrageous examples that we used in Parliament.
Yes. But it certainly was a very divisive issue. Probably it was the most divisive, I think, of all the economic reforms through that whole period, and has left a residue of
a bitter taste in terms of
people
interest.
Exactly. So then we moved on to the Rudd era and the climate change issue. And the history of that is pretty. Kevin declaring it as the moral issue of our time, and then abandoning it. So I think a whole lot of things have happened that have discredited in the public mind the political class and the reform agenda. They don't trust them. I think it's harder to make the case now for reform because of that.
Now, if people like Professor Ross Garnaut are correct, and that without substantial policy reform, we're headed for a prolonged economic slowdown, if not a recession. If that's true, then this is a problem, isn't it? Because if the reforming energy has been sapped through some pretty bad experiences over the last 15 years, then a non-reforming response to this economic outlook means that you have a recession, you have rising unemployment, and all everything that goes with it. That's
the most
bad.
Pessimistic view of that would be that maybe that's what's going to have to happen. I mean, it was the Banana Republic crisis that really...
And the jolt.
Exactly, the jolt, the shock. That, and, I mean, I hope it doesn't happen, but it may be that that's what...
I've heard it said that, and it's not a bad way of stylising it, that Australians are good in a crisis, but when there's no crisis, we go to the beach.
Yeah, that's true. And, I mean, in a general sense, that's true. So what is the jolt at the moment that says, we really have to get on with this agenda? Is it the budget? I mean, is it the fact that we've got a growing debt and fiscal policy blowout? I mean, I don't think so. I don't think the public's...
It doesn't manifest itself.
The public's worried about debt, but they don't really... it doesn't stop them going to the beach.
Yeah, that's right.
So what has to happen to avoid that disaster?
Can I put this to you then, just as a thought? You talked about a fellow that used to, what was he, the modest liberal? The modest farmer?
The modest farmer, yes.
Yeah. Now, his writings, which you say were picked up and then within the Conservative parties were very influential. There are others who are writing at that same time, which is a group essentially of economists, many of them progressive in their personal outlook, but wanted a better Australia, more people in work and all that sort of stuff. And they all piled in and wrote these learned papers, and the media at the time was actually propagating this
that's
stuff,
true.
Right? They were actually projecting it in, perhaps not in the daily newspapers and the page 3, colour girl photos, but in the kind of serious debate. That seems to have
that's the media dimension of this, which I think is significant. I think in that period, the media opinion was essentially, the influential opinion was in the media, in the print media, it was in the newspapers. There was I think, maybe in that period of 75, Channel 9 was the only television network that really covered politics in great depth. It was the political correspondents and the columnists in the daily newspapers.
So it mattered what they thought.
It mattered, yeah. Now we have a completely different media. The role of newspapers has declined. The media is much more diverse, and so it's much harder for a political leader who wants to mobilise opinion now to do that through a much more diverse media than it was then. Paul Keating was brilliant at seducing, if you like, political journalists to his cause.
Yes, and I'm told, on the other hand, if they expressed a different point of view, they got a phone call.
They were legends, the phone calls. But I don't think Joe Hockey could do that now. No. It's just anyway. If he did beat up the political correspondents to support his position, there's vast other sources of information. Another thing that's changed, and I think it changed a bit because of people were tired of the whole economic reform thing, was the shift in the political debate to cultural issues, to issues, which are much more divisive. I think they do divide left and right much more sharply than did the economic debate, and so much more energy in the media now goes into those issues. Yes. For example, I think the predominance of column writers in Australia, either online or in the print media or where else, tend to be from the right, and they don't write about economic reform. No. There's very little. If you pick up those columns, they never write about the economy. Yeah. Or if they do, it was only about.
We need a bit more protection.
Some of them do.
Some of them are actually anti.
That's right.
Openness.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. That culture wars, for want of a better phrase, is actually infecting some of the debates that do have economic content, such as the climate change debate.
Yes, and
there's a lot of economics in the climate change debate. It's not all about culture, but interestingly, you will not find someone from the hard right who believes that there is a problem of climate change. And to be fair, you won't find someone from the hard left who believes that there isn't. It's as if this is our tribe and that's your tribe and these are our beliefs.
Yes, yeah.
And you just don't get the
that's a classic
objective debate anymore.
Example of polarisation and the difficulty of building a consensus now on something that's hotly contested. Yeah. But the majority believes needs to be done.
To what extent is this polarisation, which has occurred in the media, do you think that has affected the political debate, or is the media reflecting the political debate? That is, has the political debate become polarised, as it has in the United States with the Tea Party and then people who might, on the other side, and there's just a knockdown, drag-out brawl every day? So you could argue that's not a product of the media.
No, that's right.
Yeah. Or is it the product of the media, and then the politicians say, well, unless we come up with one-line statements that concur with the preconceived positions of our poll supporters, we're not going to.
Well, I think it's a bit of each, right? And I couldn't apportion, percentages to either cause, but I think the media, the really strident commentators have had quite a significant effect on public opinion on this. And but there are other factors. I think the timing of the introduction of the ETS, just as the drought ended. Yeah. I think the public view that there was a crisis and something needed to be done was very much fed by the fact that there was a very, very serious drought.
And John Howard has recently described that as a perfect storm.
Yes.
In recanting his own emissions trading scheme when he said, "Oh, well, I did that, but gee, the politics was, made me do it because there was a drought."
That's right.
And so he said, "I didn't, the influence. I didn't really believe in the first place."
No, that's right. Whereas when Gillard decided to do the carbon tax, we had rain. I mean, it rained every day, and people said, "Well, why the hell do we need to do that?"
Yes.
And when Tony Abbott decided to take this on as the cause on which he wanted to ride through to become Prime Minister, and really stridently oppose it, people said, "Well,
why do we
need to do this?" And plus the other elements, political elements to that, which made it very, very hard. So, so no, there's a whole combination of factors. But.
And is there a role for technology here? And let me just elaborate. Online media is very important now, and it's not going to diminish in importance; it'll only grow. So the specialist writers, the investigative journalists, a lot of them are gone because the more conventional media cannot afford to keep them on.
Yes.
Does that lead to a superficiality in debate, and therefore just go and get a grab from this extreme group and get another one from this extreme group and put it to air?
I think the digitalisation of the media has. I mean, people say this is a good thing because it's means that there's a much wider opinion base. People can express views on Twitter or whatever. But I think it's also shallower. I think that
broader but
shallower. Yeah. So you don't get on Twitter. A deep economic debate.
Characters.
Exactly, you can't get a deep economic debate going.
I've been asked on Twitter to explain Labor's economic policy.
140 characters.
What? 140 characters.
Yeah. Also, my sense is that social media, to some extent, has become a forum for the elite.
Mm-hmm.
I think Twitter is very much an elitist forum. I think it's it's out in Western Sydney. Not too many people follow Twitter. But those people who are engaged in the debate are having that debate on Twitter, but it's not getting down to the Western suburbs or to the community more generally.
Question, but where do you see it going then? I mean, we've created a picture here of polarisation of the debate. No, not even really an attempt at consensus. It seems, like the consensus politics doesn't seem to be fashionable. And the digital era is just going to intensify, isn't it? Is it just all gloom?
Well, that's going to intensify. That's for sure.
Can you see any positive signs?
I hate to say it, but I think there is a big role for political leadership in this, and I think there's some difficult decisions to be made by the Labor Party and by Bill Shorten in particular about whether he's going to be a Tony Abbott style oppositionist or whether he's going to be a John Howard style opposition, if you like, in the sense of being willing to say, okay, there are issues on which we disagree, but there are issues that we have to identify as issues in the national interest.
And he has said that he wants to be in the
latter, but the test will be
the actual, as each issue arrives, because, I mean, human nature, any one issue that arrives, there's a lot of pressure on an opposition leader of whatever political persuasion to oppose it.
Yes, exactly.
From
more
within,
so than ever. Yeah.
From within.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Well, especially now because of the way that Tony Abbott conducted his campaign to become Prime Minister. A lot of people in the Labor Party said, well, we're going to get back to him what he gave to us. Exactly.
Yeah.
And you can understand that sentiment. But I don't think the media can lead the elitists down this track. I mean, in the end, it's leaders who set these agendas and make the case.
And what about the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott? What's his role in this?
Well, his role is a leadership role as well.
Right.
And I think it's early days and it's hard yet to identify what sort of Prime Minister he's going to be. I mean, he's had a chaotic start. I think the critical moment in Australia about the issues we're talking about is going to be the response to the Audit Commission and the first budget.
So we're going to know pretty quickly.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's right. I think there are some very important people in the coalition who recognise that there are big challenges that have got to be taken on. But I think there are others in the coalition who are old style conservatives, and I think the most obvious delineation of that is the National Party and the Liberal Party.
Yeah.
But I think there are elements of it in the Liberal Party as well.
So what should come out, philosophically, what should come out of the budget, not in dollars and cents or particular programs, but what would you like to be able to summarise the budget as having said?
Well, the budget's got to. Well, I think the thing about the budget and the Audit Commission is that is where the Abbott government has to lay out its cards on the table. It has to say, this is what we think is important for the Australian economy. These are the things that we need to do.
Yeah. And not just in the budget.
Not just in the budget.
Yeah, I understand.
I use the budget
exactly.
So we can debate about what the deficit should be and how much they should cut from spending. No, it's not just dollars and cents. It's a statement about priorities.
Yeah.
And if you look back, I wrote this recently. If you look back in recent history, I think this moment is comparable with the Banana Republic moment.
Yeah.
With the first Howard Costello budget,
1996,
the response to the GFC.
Yeah,
these were really big moments. Yeah,
and I can remind you on that Banana Republic moment, what actually happened is yes, big savings needed to be made. But the phraseology that was adopted was restraint with equity.
Yes.
So the argument for restraining spending was put because the rest of the world was paying us less, but it needed to be seen to be fair.
Yes, yeah.
And interestingly, going back into politics, there was a budget in 1986 and then a statement in early 1987. They were almost the biggest cuts in spending in history. The Gillard government's last budget was the biggest cuts in history. But the Labor vote went up.
Yes, right, yeah.
It went up because it was seen to be fair.
Yeah. Well, I think that's... Yeah. I think the public is quite willing to accept the need for things to be done if they're done in a fair way.
Yeah, and for a good reason.
Yeah. I think, obviously this government's... Joe Hockey's identified the sort of entitlement problem, the middle class welfare thing. There's clearly some big decisions got to be made about that, but the working people will not take kindly to being belted as part of that process. I mean, there's difficult decisions about the level of wages in Australia. I think, which you've and Ross have alluded to.
Yeah.
But if this government's agenda is purely about workplace reform, then
they'll get hammered.
Exactly.
Yeah, they'll get hammered.
Yeah.
And even on the middle class welfare, I mean, the truth is the previous government did quite a lot of paring back on middle class welfare, and they were all opposed by the coalition.
Yeah.
Now the coalition's talking about disability support, pension, and New Start, but want to introduce an extravagant paid parental leave scheme. I don't think you can make changes here while saying, what we can afford.
I think that's right. And I mean, I really think the paid parental leave scheme is an indulgence that I mean, this is probably a very important test of Abbott's leadership. He should stand up and say, okay, I believe in this scheme, it's important for the country in the long term, but at the moment, it's, we've got higher priorities. Exactly. And we'll come back to it.
Yeah.
And I don't think that would be a sort of Kevin Rudd climate change moment, ETS moment. I think that would be seen as quite the opposite to that. It would be.
We'll see what happens.
Yeah, that's right. So,
Geoff, if there's one thing that you could change, I mean, given all of your experience, everything that you've seen, where we are now, what would you see as the most important change that would give you the greatest sort of sense that we're making progress?
I think a real consensus returning about what we need to do. And I think there's a role for the business leadership in that. I think there's a role for the academic institutions, and I think there's a very important role for the political leaders in recognising that things have to change, and that we've got to sit down and work out what those changes are going to be. Maybe an economic summit.
I was about, as you were speaking, this is exactly what Hawke did in the early days of his government. Maybe an economic summit involving business, union movement, community organisations, government, federal, state, because of the issues there, and set out what the problems are, and then say, come on, let's work together to solve this.
Yes. Well, people thought it was a bit of a joke when Hawke first proposed it, and a lot of people in the Labor Party thought that.
That's right.
But it wasn't. It was very, very effective, and maybe it's time to do something like that again. I can't see Tony Abbott doing it, because I think his view is that governments make these decisions and set these directions. But
building consensus is very important.
Exactly, and it was consensus that allowed reform to occur at the speed that it did, and in the scope that it did. And I don't think it's going to be possible without some sort of consensus being achieved again.
Geoff Kitney, thank you very much for appearing on Emmo Forum.
My pleasure.